We are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Joining me once again is our good friend Richard Wolff. Professor Wolff is, in fact, Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He is also a visiting professor at the New York University, I believe, School of International Affairs, if I recall correctly. And he is the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV on Tuesday evenings. And he is always a source of insight for us here on this program. We always appreciate having him. So first of all, Richard Wolff, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thank you, RJ. Glad to be here.
So let's talk about the story that's getting all the attention here in Washington, D.C. these days, which is the two bills circulating right now regarding primarily infrastructure. I think one was originally called the American Jobs Plan, but and without getting into the details of the state of the various legislation or Senate minutia, because I don't really think that's the most critical dimension of this. You know, as everyone knows, there's a bipartisan bill that claims to spend roughly $1 trillion, although if you scratch the surface, it's about half that, a little more than half that. Then there is a framework, and I don't think anyone has been able to tell me what a framework is precisely, but there's a framework that's been passed for $3.5 trillion in additional spending and all sorts of legerdemain. We'll do one thing bipartisan, and then we'll do the other thing, reconciliation. It's called simple majority. But this is, as I've been talking about a lot lately, being touted as, you know, the biggest thing since FDR and transformative and that sort of thing. But I worry, and I worry that it's not enough. I worry that it's not going to all the right places. I worry that it's the one shot people have right now, and it's leaving fundamental issues unaddressed. And I wonder, first of all, from your point of view, am I worrying unnecessarily?
No, in my humble opinion, you're not worrying enough.
Okay.
The opposite. And let me explain a little bit why. First of all, it's an amazing comment on American history that the best you can say for this is that it's almost as good as what was done in the Great Depression. Because what that means is that since the Great Depression, the New Deal, which was almost a century ago, we have been as a nation unable to build on what was accomplished then. That was always the promise. Neither the union members in the CIO, nor the Socialist and Communist Party activists who helped create the New Deal, nor even President Roosevelt thought of the New Deal as the end of the line, as the great finished work. It was a beginning. It was an attempt to begin to do something for the mass of people in this country that corresponded to what the wealth of this country makes possible. But the sad reality is nothing was built upon. We have gone backwards. Let me explain. The Social Security benefits given originally, if you adjust for prices, were more generous than what we give the elderly and those who have a physical impairment today. The minimum wage, the first time it was passed in the 1930s, was worth more in terms of what you could afford to buy with it than what the minimum wage is now. And the most ambitious program of the New Deal, which was the federal jobs program, the program that hired 15 million unemployed Americans between 1934 and 1941, saving them from unemployment, enabling them to earn a decent income, to pay the mortgage for their home, the rent for their apartment. We have now gone through several unemployment binges like the 1930s, including the last 16 months. And there's been absolutely no federal jobs program. It wasn't even a question of matching what was done before. We've done nothing. So here's the bottom line. To say that this is the most ambitious program since the New Deal is to admit that the Democratic Party, the labor movement, whatever you want to call the mass of the people in this country's organizations, could not even protect and preserve what was won back then. And here's now my second point, and you'll see how these link together. In the 1930s, we had a terrible economic crash. So have we had over the last 18 months. But what we didn't have in the 1930s was a simultaneous public health catastrophe. We have had viral pandemics before, but never at the same time as an economic capitalist crash. That makes what we're going through now absolutely unique. Over the last 18 months, more than half, this is a number that doesn't get the attention it deserves, more than half of the members of the labor force in the United States have had to endure some period of unemployment. For some, it was only a few weeks. For some, it was the entire year and a half. When you are unemployed for weeks, you lose money. You use up any savings you might have had. You become a burden on your family, your friends, as you lean on them to compensate for what you're not earning. And I won't even go in to the strains and stresses on marriages, on families, on relationships in general. You have subjected this working class of the United States to record stresses and strains and sufferings, only made worse by watching the top 10% see their wealth go up during the pandemic while the mass of people suffer. In a society like ours, which used to celebrate, quote, we're all in the middle class, or quote, this is a people's capitalism, they've just had a really cold shower to remind them that all of that was BS. None of it was true. In the face of all of that, here comes the third and final point. We have a dysfunctional political system. Every politician, whether it's a mayor or a senator or a president or a governor, has a built-in incentive. They want to go to the electorate and get elected. And in order to do that, they have to, on the one hand, provide services, and on the other, raise taxes to pay to provide services. Okay, they get voted out if they don't provide the services, but they also get voted out if they raise the taxes. How do they respond? Here we go. One thing they do, they borrow money. But of course, that has to be paid back, which is a burden next year and the year after and the year after. Number two, you have to pay interest. Now you're not just getting enough money to build a sewer, but you're having to pay interest for years, as well as pay back the price of building the sewer. So guess what? Politicians everywhere solve their problem by not keeping up the roads, the bridges, the sewers, the hospital buildings, the school plant and equipment, and I could go on. We don't have an infrastructure problem for any other reason than the capitalist system and the way it works. We have built-in incentive for every politician to avoid going to the people to raise taxes, to limit the amount of money they have to borrow because they haven't the courage to tax the wealth that's there. So what they do is they let the infrastructure slide. We've been letting it slide for 75 years. So the numbers you're hearing, $1 trillion, are made to sound like a lot, but they're not a lot because they're just the big number that is the addition of all the lesser amounts that our system failed to utilize to maintain the infrastructure. And make no mistake, infrastructure is an urgent economic reality. Let me give you a simple example. If the bridge is busted, if it breaks, if it's got a lot of maintenance on it, then the trucks can't go over it the way they used to. It takes a longer time. They have to go around. They have to wait. Let's now look at that. Our competitor, and I'm going to pick the most important one in the world today, the People's Republic of China, they have a brand new infrastructure. They spend a fortune on their infrastructure, way more than the United States is considering now, even though they are a much poorer country. Their trucks get there in record time because they don't have to waste extra fuel going around an unmaintained bridge or 10, taking a longer time to go through the roads because they're full of potholes, and on and on. And you know what that means? It's cheaper to produce something in China because all those little costs that you have to incur as a business when the infrastructure isn't working, when the schools are closed because they're too hot, they're too cold, they leak, they are unusable, and then children lose parts of their education. And so the skill level they have when they're 18 isn't what it could have been and what it used to be, and on. And I could go on forever with this. But you neglect your infrastructure, and it is certain to come back in a few years and bite you in the rear end, economically speaking. Those are the problems we have, and they're problems of a system. It's not that our roads don't work. It's not that we lack the people to keep them up. We don't lack any of that. We have the machinery, we have the know-how, we have the raw material, we have it all. We have what it needs not to be in this situation, but we have a system that produces this situation. It's a little bit like COVID. Do we have the doctors? Do we have the medical producers who can make the masks, the gloves, the vet? Of course we do. We have the hospital. We have it all. We're a very rich country. But with a mere 4% of the world's people, we have accounted for 20% of the world's deaths from COVID. That's a failure of the system. And now my final conclusion, which touches on something you said, RJ. None of these bills deal with the system. They're going to throw money, which isn't enough given the many, many years of neglect of our infrastructure, which make it look like a great deal, but it isn't relative to what the problem is. But the worst of it is the big contracts are going to go to the big corporations who are going to take a big fat profit out of all of these repair projects. Nothing is going to be changed in the distribution of income and power, which means the politicians of the next 25 years are going to be as neglectful as they were in the last 25 years for the same reasons, because nothing is being changed. This is an example of an empire, of a system that is declining. It can't get out of the rut, even though if it could, it has the raw materials and the people to break out. It just doesn't know how, so it keeps on going in the same direction. And for me, it's sad to watch the effort at enthusiasm, even from people I admire, Bernie Sanders and the others. They're enthusiastic for something which is better than what their colleagues are willing to do. And they're right about that. It is. But it falls so far short that it's one of those moments where you say, yes, it's better than not doing it, but boy, is it inadequate.
You know, and it struck me and continues to strike me that the inability of the electoral left, for lack of a term, as the Democratic Party left, to function on a dual level of being able to say this is much better than nothing, but falls far short of the systemic change we need. And to me, it's striking that very few, if any, people are saying that right now, when I think people are, in many ways, probably ready for systemic change. And Richard Wolff, there's an aspect of this I was thinking as you were talking that I think doesn't get mentioned nearly enough, which is, maybe could be called the microeconomic impact of these broad systemic failures. For example, I think it was the American Society of Civil Engineers that said the average car owner spends $300 more per year or more than that because we fail to maintain our roads, and it damages your car. You have to replace the brakes, you have to replace the shock absorbers or whatever. That is in effect a regressive tax on car owners, and poorer people with older cars suffer more from that because their cars are more susceptible to the damage. Also, and then I'll stop and get your thoughts, but an enterprising, by no means lefty reporter from The Atlantic was reading about the Beatles in 1964, landing at Shea Stadium, doing concerts in New York, and then he noticed that the article said they then took the 2-hour and 10-minute Metroliner trip to Washington, D.C. for their next concert. And he thought, that's strange. It takes 3 hours now. I wonder why that is. So he started calling engineers, and they said, well, we haven't really maintained the tracks. We haven't maintained the grades properly. The train bounces around a lot more, tilts a lot, has to slow down for these grades now in a way that it wouldn't have if we didn't maintain them. So the train now takes an hour longer. Now, if you don't have the money for what's now called the Acela, which most people don't, and you take the local train, it probably adds a couple hours to the trip. You throw that in the mix, then somebody's got to go take care of their mother in New York from D.C., suddenly they're missing 2 more hours of work, on and on and on. A million different ways in which these big picture issues, I think, address each and every one of us. And I think we've also, or certainly the political, sphere has failed to address the ways in which our inability to act collectively is hurting us all individually. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I would go even further. I think most people know this story. I mean, you put it very well. And the example of the automobile maintenance is excellent. But we all kind of know, we learn as children, take a toothbrush, put some toothpaste on it, do your teeth in the evening. Yeah, it's a pain. It's a waste of a few moments. But when I tell you what you're going to go through with dentists later, if you don't, and most children get the idea, see a doctor regularly so that you don't wait until it's so bad that it's a major surgery or something else that you need. We kind of know. Most people have that experience. And so it isn't all that hard to say, look, we have to, in a rational way, take care of this. But the desire of our system, the corporations that run are so determined not to pay taxes. And the wealthy who learn from their positions at the top of these corporations to internalize the values. I'm a smarty. I'm a very clever fellow, like Mr. Trump said, if I don't pay any taxes, if I can weasel my way out, and so on and on. And you have a political system made up of these people, so they're not going to confront themselves as a class or as a group. So you have this kind of crazy staying in the rut, not addressing what is the underlying problem. There has to be maintenance of your infrastructure. And that's not just the physical. It's also maintain your public education system. That's the single most important shaper of your labor force. And if you're a country competing in the world economy, you have to maintain the quality and the quantity of your skilled labor force. If you neglect your school system, which this system does exactly in the same way that it neglects its infrastructure, which schools basically are a part of, you're going to find yourself less and less able to compete. And let me drive it home with an example. People think that corporations left the United States starting in the 1970s in huge numbers to take advantage of the lower wages abroad. And that's true. But the lower wages were not the only factor. Here was another one. In China, India, and Brazil, they had devoted themselves to developing the technical abilities of large numbers of their young people so that they could offer to the big corporations not only lower wages, but lower wages for workers that were just about as skilled as those left behind. Could the United States have retained those jobs? Answer, yes. Had you invested in education, had you produced better trained, better educated workers because the classes were smaller and the education system more generously funded to do that the way they did in the People's Republic of China, for example, you would have lost a lot fewer jobs. I mean, over and over again, the rush for rich people who are already among the richest in the world to become richer still, this is killing this society. And the people who watch it and think that it's some sort of spectator sport really need to think again. The hundreds of millions of dollars spent on the amusement that Jeffrey Bezos and Richard Branson could go and spend a few minutes in space was money that could have been and should have been put to much more important use for millions of people. Watching that as an amusement is a little bit like getting all dressed up to go to a hanging when the person to be hanged is you.
That's a vivid and colorful image. And, you know, earlier on, you presented kind of three dimensions of the problem between the private sector, the perverse motivations of elected officials, and now the introduction of the pandemic. And there's a fourth dimension to this, of course, and to me, it's the elephant in the room in everything we're talking about nowadays and in all our politics, which is the impending planetary catastrophe, the catastrophe that's already begun, that we're seeing in the wildfires, that we're seeing in the floods, that we're seeing in, you know, so many other manifestations, perhaps no one single one of which can be attributed to climate change, but collectively certainly can. And so we're seeing this unfold. We've got the new report we've been talking about it a lot here, you know, the declared a code red for humanity on the environment. And yet we're seeing this sort of bizarre, detached, oh, well, we'll do something about it kind of attitude in the face of, you know, an onrushing tidal wave. So we'll have to do something about that at some point. You know, we'll put it in our next wave of bills or whatever. And to me, it's I don't know what to say except that it's an utter failure of the system as well, isn't it? I mean, am I being negative here? Or
No, I mean, people have been telling me ever since I went to college that capitalism is the most efficient economic system available to solve the problems of the human race and to give us prosperity and economic growth. And here we are talking about all of those things that it's giving us that we don't need and we don't want, and that literally threaten our existence. I mean, I give you another example. People like Jeffrey Bezos, Bill Gates, and a whole bunch of others like to now say that they are sensitive, to the climate issue, that they realize that they're, and they mean it. I have no reason to doubt that they mean it. But then this last week, they got exposed. How? It turns out that they've made huge investments of their own personal wealth in an enormous project to start mining for special materials in Greenland, where there has never been this kind of mining, where this will introduce pollution and every kind of climate problem that Greenland has luckily avoided because it's in the north, because it's cold, and all the rest. And, people are attacking them for being hypocritical, but that's missing the larger point. They don't invest their money themselves. What those wealthy people do is they give their money to something called hedge funds or investment banks or others to manage. That's the normal thing. They don't know enough and they don't have the time, they don't have the interest, so they give it. And you know what that moment of giving means? I am turning my wealth over to the normal capitalist process. And that is use wealth to make more wealth. That's the bottom line. That's the goal. Everything else is either irrelevant or secondary. So their wealth managers, whatever the hedge funds are they gave it to, understanding what their role in capitalism is, went around and found a whole bunch of profitable investment outlets where to put that money, including the polluting new mines in Greenland. And what was it for? Turns out in Greenland, there are certain rare minerals which are very necessary for electrically powered vehicles, automobiles. And we're now in a transition from, as you know, from the gas-fired car to the electrically operated car. Now, if you have half a brain, just half, you know that what we need is to conserve on all of the wastes of this planet, not just the fossil fuels. Having private cars that spend most of their lives sitting in a garage or on the street for the few times that we each use them is lunacy. Mass transportation, public transportation, whatever you want to call it, is the way we need to move people. Fast, efficient, infinitely cheaper, less metal, less plastic, less fossil fuel, less pollution. I mean, this is nuts. We need electrically run mass transport. If it were mass transport, you wouldn't need to mine in Greenland because you'd need many fewer of the things because you can move more people per mile in a collective van or bus or train or tram or any other mass transportation system. So if they really cared about the environment, that's the obvious way to go. But they don't. They see a profit opportunity. And yeah, the night before at a college or in a church, they waxed poetic about the environment. But they're married to the capitalist system that made them rich. And so it proceeds to do exactly what they want. And I wouldn't even be surprised one day to turn on my television and see the investors in that project in Greenland speaking about the urgent need to save our planet. And it won't actually be hypocrisy because this is so ingrained that they don't even see what they are doing in the sense that we do. And that's another sign that we're not dealing with this or that particular problem. We're dealing with a system that has captured the people in it. That relationship has to be broken, or we have no chance to get out of the disasters that keep piling up. It's almost biblical. We have the fires, we have the COVID virus, we have the flooding, we have the long supply chains that keep being interrupted, the enormous ship that gets trapped in the Suez Canal. I mean, it really is a time when, if I could transpose the Bible, something fundamental is wrong here. Stop being attached to this or that symptom. Start asking the question, what is the system out of which all of these plagues, which is what they are, what is the system that holds them up, that creates them, and which, if we can change it, solve these problems rather than kicking them down the road. So we have to go through this charade of a debate. Look how much we're spending on infrastructure, rather than how in the hell did we get an infrastructure so desperately underdeveloped that we have to spend a lot of money.
And you know, you're just a thought on your before we go on your infrastructure, on your mass transit remarks. You know, a lot of people hear mass transit and they think, well, you know, it'd be such a pain in the neck to have to walk 3 blocks to a bus stop, and it would take longer and all that. But if people could, if we could develop the communal sense that by doing that, we're part of something greater than ourselves. We're part of saving our planet. We're part of making a more just society. I think the people who today who go, oh God, life's hard enough as it is, if they had humane work, if they were moving toward, you know, all of these things, that I think that, you know, as it was when I was behind the Iron Curtain years ago and took a tram car, people like took pleasure in is because I forgot to put the little kopeck in or whatever. And the thing somebody said to me in Hungarian, my colleague translated, comrade, if you don't put your, you know, coin in, then the other comrades running the system won't be able to keep it going, you know. And it was kind of like this sense of, but I'm not saying the Hungarian system was ideal, but it was a sense of solidarity, right? And if we can somehow adopt that sense of a collective purpose to things like rebuilding mass transit, building mass transit from in the first place, using it for the greater good, and being part of something collective, you know, I'm optimistic we could make some changes, but I'll give you the last word.
No, I agree with you. And I think there are examples. I think there are collective efforts that people engage in all the time, even if they don't call them that, to sustain a baseball team that you all play in after work, to sustain your local Rotary Club, to sustain your church, to sustain whatever you do, even if it's as small as your family unit. You kind of try to share the work. You try to show a kind of solidarity because you want that extended to you. If you're having a problem, it's really wonderful if your relatives come over and bring a casserole so you can get through the evening without having to stop and cook a dinner for your kids or whatever. People know this stuff. Americans like to tell stories about how barns were built in ancient, villages as we, decimated the Native Americans and moved across the prairie. The first barn, everybody in the village got together to build a barn for the Brown family. And then everybody got together, including the Browns, to build a barn for the Smith family. And so it went, because everybody understood we need your labor to do something that none of us could do for ourselves. It would take too long. It would be too difficult. We can't take our time away from the fields that we have to plow. I mean, it was an understanding of the mutual benefit you get. If I were an economist in a position to do it, I would take your idea about the automobile, what we've been talking, and I would do a calculation. And I would be able to go to the American people and say, here's something we can have a referendum on. If you vote yes, we keep the private automobile. Everybody has one. Stick it in your garage. Take it out once or twice a day. leave it most of the time gathering rust and dust and losing value. And I'll work it out, arithmetic. And I say, now, if we substitute a van system where the van comes down your street no less frequently than every 4 minutes, which, by the way, is easy to do, and it goes in 25 different places with minimal changes, and that you will be able to vote on wanting to change it if it isn't convenient. And if you do that, we will save the following $400 million, half of which we'll distribute to each of you in this community, and it'll be worth $6,412. Now I see. You mean I'm going to get 612, whatever it is, $100,
Right.
$1,000. I'm going to get, because that's how much we're going to save. And we're going to make at least part of it available to you individually as a training exercise, so you understand these things could be done better. But we have to break out of the notion that what ought to guide every production decision is the profit some individual capitalist can make out of it. As long as we're held hostage to the profit system, the problems we now face will not go away.
Well, I want to find that economist you're talking about, and I want to do that project because I think that's a fantastic way to put it together. But unfortunately, we'll have to end it there. So, Richard Wolff, I won't list all your accomplishments and titles again in the interest of time. But as always, great pleasure talking with you. As always, thank you for your insights and thank you for coming on the program.
And thank you for having a program like this that has these conversations. I only wish there were many more, but in any case, I look forward to speaking with you again pretty soon.
As do I. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.